Karen Mitchell, a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, strode through the gates of Buckingham Palace with a sense of entitlement. She had just arrived, her heels clicking against the pavement as she glanced at her wristwatch. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the grand structure in front of her. She had been looking forward to this visit for weeks. Buckingham Palace was one of the most iconic landmarks in London, a symbol of British royalty and history. It was a place where dreams came true, where royalty walked the halls, and where commoners like herself could glimpse a life beyond their reach. But there was one problem: she was late. Her tour, scheduled for 4 p.m., had already started, and by the time she had arrived at the palace, the clock read 4:30. She hadn't anticipated the traffic, nor had she calculated the time it would take to get through the crowded streets of London. But now, there was no turning back. She was here, and she wasn't about to miss the opportunity to experience what the world had to offer. She approached the palace's entrance, where a young staff member stood at the gate, politely welcoming guests. Karen's gaze flickered to the large sign next to the entrance that stated the visiting hours. It clearly indicated that tours had a strict schedule and that no late arrivals could be accommodated. But Karen had a different perspective. "I'm Karen Mitchell," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. "I've traveled all the way from the United States for this tour, and I expect to be allowed in, even if I'm a little late." The young staff member, a man in his early 20s, looked at her with a mixture of confusion and professionalism. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the tours are scheduled for specific times, and we can't allow any exceptions due to security protocols." Karen's face twisted into an expression of disbelief. "Security protocols? Don't you know who I am? I'm a VIP. My family is wealthy, and I have connections. I'm sure someone can make an exception for me." The young staff member remained calm, his hands clasped in front of him. He had been trained for situations like this. Buckingham Palace was a world-renowned establishment, and every day, it received thousands of visitors. Some were respectful, some were understanding, and others were not. But he had learned the importance of maintaining composure, especially in the face of demanding tourists. "I apologize, ma'am," he said with a polite smile. "But as I mentioned, the visiting hours are set for security reasons. And we are unable to alter them. I understand that this may be disappointing, but I must ask that you respect the guidelines." Karen's anger flared. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I've traveled halfway across the world, and I'm not going to be told I can't enter just because of some arbitrary rule. I demand to speak to someone higher up." The staff member nodded, still calm. "Of course, ma'am. I can have a supervisor come out to speak with you. Please wait here." As he stepped away to make the call, Karen's frustration continued to build. How could this young man deny her entry? Didn't they understand the importance of her visit? She had worked hard to get here. And now, at the peak of her excitement, she was being turned away. She crossed her arms and paced back and forth, her mind racing with thoughts of how to get her way out. A few minutes later, a supervisor arrived, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. She had clearly seen this type of situation before. Karen immediately launched into her demands. "I've already explained to your colleague," she began, her voice sharp. "I'm a VIP, and I demand to be let in. My time is valuable, and I'm not going to waste it standing out here while other people are allowed inside." The supervisor raised an eyebrow but maintained her professionalism. "I understand that you are upset, ma'am, but as I've already explained, the palace operates under strict guidelines for all visitors. Security is our primary concern, and we cannot make exceptions, no matter who you are." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have the means to get what I want. I'll make sure this place is ruined if I have to. I'll have your job, and I'll make sure your reputation is destroyed. You'll regret turning me away." The supervisor stood firm, unfazed by Karen's threats. "I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am. But our rules are in place for everyone's safety. I'm afraid there is nothing I can do." Karen's outburst continued, her anger now fully boiling over. She raised her hand and, in a moment of frustration, slapped the supervisor across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the courtyard, leaving the supervisor momentarily stunned. The crowd, which had gathered near the entrance, gasped in shock. Several tourists nearby pulled out their phones, eager to capture the spectacle. The young staff member, now witnessing the escalation, stepped forward to intervene. "Ma'am, that is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice firm but still respectful. "Please step away from the supervisor immediately." Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "You can't do anything to me," she spat. "I'll have you all fired." But before she could say another word, a group of security officers appeared at the scene. They had been monitoring the situation from a distance, and now, they stepped in to ensure that Karen's behavior did not escalate further. "Ma'am, we need you to leave the premises," one of the officers said, his tone firm but calm. "You are causing a disturbance, and we cannot allow that here. Please, follow us." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment and rage. She had never been treated like this before. No one had ever dared to challenge her, to deny her what she felt she was entitled to. But now, she was being escorted away from the palace, her dream of a royal experience shattered. As she was led out of the gates, she glared at the supervisor and staff member, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. But deep down, as the reality of the situation sank in, she knew that this was not how she had wanted her visit to end. It was a lesson she would not soon forget. No amount of money or status could change the rules when it came to security and respect, and as she left Buckingham Palace, the crowd slowly dispersed, their whispers of disbelief hanging in the air. The incident would be remembered not for the grandeur of the palace, but for the explosive outburst of one entitled tourist. As the staff member turned to walk away, his decision final, Karen's fury reached new heights. Her lips curled into a tight, disdainful smile, one that was more venomous than anything else she had shown so far. She had made up her mind, she would not leave without stepping foot inside the palace. "Is that it then?" Karen scoffed, raising her voice so the nearby tourists could hear. "You think a little security rule is going to stop me? Just because you've got a uniform on doesn't mean you can treat me like this." The young staff member paused for a moment, taking a slow breath, and then turned back toward her, trying to remain calm in the face of her rising hysteria. "I'm truly sorry, ma'am, but as I said, the guidelines are non-negotiable. I've already called for a supervisor, and I don't need a supervisor." Karen interrupted, her voice growing louder. "I need someone who understands how things work around here. I don't want some child playing at being in charge. I'm not going to let a rule designed for the masses stop me from experiencing something that should have been mine to begin with." The young man's patience was wearing thin, but he stayed professional, his expression neutral. He knew that no matter how much she raged, the rules were the rules, and he wasn't in a position to change them. But Karen wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes darted across the courtyard, scanning the scene for an opening, something to exploit. Then, as if guided by some twisted sense of destiny, her eyes landed on a royal guard, standing resolutely by the palace gates. His red uniform, tall black hat, and flawless posture gave him an air of unshakable authority. He stood as a living symbol of British tradition and regal dignity. To Karen, this guard, with his silence and stillness, was the embodiment of everything she despised in the service industry, a mere pawn standing in the way of greatness. Karen's gaze narrowed with a new plan forming in her mind. She straightened her back, lifting her chin in defiance, and strode over toward the guard with an exaggerated, purposeful step. The staff member, seeing her approach the guard, quickly moved to stop her, his voice now tinged with desperation. "Ma'am, please don't." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She reached the guard, her heels clicking loudly against the stone pavement, and then stopped just a few inches away from him. She could almost feel the crowd's eyes on her, watching, waiting. She could feel their judgment, their anticipation. With a haughty expression, Karen looked up at the silent guard, her tone dripping with condescension. "Excuse me, soldier," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Do you know who I am?" The guard did not respond. He stood motionless, not even blinking, his posture as straight as a rod. "I said," Karen repeated, louder this time, "do you know who I am? I'm Karen Mitchell, a woman of status and means. I am a person of importance, and I demand that you allow me inside. Now." The royal guard remained silent. His eyes were fixed ahead, his jaw tight. He had been trained for moments like this, but something about the audacity of Karen's behavior gnawed at him. "I will not be ignored," Karen snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you how it's going to be. Step aside, now." Still, the guard said nothing. His complete and utter lack of reaction was a stark contrast to the rising storm inside Karen. She felt humiliated. Like she wasn't even being acknowledged. No one had dared to treat her this way, and it infuriated her beyond measure. Her mouth twisted into a sneer. "You must think you're so important, standing there with your little hat," Karen said, laughing bitterly. "Just a puppet for the royal family. I could have you fired with a single phone call. So why don't you do yourself a favor and move out of my way before I make a scene?" At that, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was palpable. Some tourists exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared speak up. No one dared intervene. Karen, in all her self-righteous fury, thought she had won, that this royal guard would finally give in to her demands. But the guard, unmoving, seemed to challenge her at every turn, unyielding and as cold as the stone walls behind him. With a sharp, almost mocking laugh, Karen took a step forward. She was going to make sure the guard knew just how powerful she was. She reached out, her hand poised to slap his face, an attempt to provoke him into a reaction, a challenge to his dignity, but just as her hand was about to make contact, something unexpected happened. The guard's hand, quick as lightning, shot out and grabbed her wrist mid-air, stopping her in her tracks. The grip was firm, cold, and without a hint of mercy. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Karen felt a deep chill run through her, as if all her self-righteousness had been wiped away in a single moment. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd, once murmuring and restless, now fell utterly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief, her anger now replaced by a flicker of fear. She tried to yank her arm free, but the guard's grip only tightened. His eyes, cold and emotionless, locked with hers, and he spoke for the first time. "Ma'am, I suggest you step away." The words were simple, but they held a weight that no one could ignore. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an order. It was a statement, one that carried the full authority of his position. Karen's mind raced, trying to process the situation. But the more she fought to break free, the more she realized, she had overplayed her hand. The guard wasn't going to let her get away with this. Finally, with a last futile attempt to escape his grasp, she stumbled backward, her pride completely shattered. The royal guard released her wrist, and Karen, her face flushed with humiliation, stood in stunned silence. The crowd watched, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. With nothing left to say, Karen turned away, her head held low. The reality of the situation had settled in. She was not entitled to special treatment. She was not above the rules. And for the first time in her life, Karen Mitchell had been taught a lesson in humility. The royal guard stood still, watching her retreating figure, his expression unchanged. In the end, it wasn't his duty to fight back, but simply to stand firm. He had done just that, and Karen had learned the hard way that some rules, like respect and dignity, were never to be trifled with. Karen's frustration boiled over as she stormed toward the royal guard, her heels clicking aggressively against the stone pavement. The crowd seemed to part for her as she advanced with a sense of superiority that could only come from someone who truly believed the world revolved around them. The guard stood tall and unmoving, his back straight, his black hat perched perfectly atop his head. His eyes were fixed ahead, his posture as rigid as the centuries-old stone that surrounded him. To Karen, he looked like nothing more than a statue, a symbol of pomp and circumstance. Not a living, breathing person capable of reasoning or feeling. Excuse me, soldier. Karen's voice rang out, louder than necessary, as she stepped right into the guard's personal space, placing herself directly in front of him. She was close enough that she could see the tiny details of his uniform, the gleaming brass buttons, the crisp red fabric, and, to her, these details felt like a trivial display of military pretense. I'm talking to you, soldier, she snapped again, pushing against his unwavering stillness. Do you have a brain in that silly head of yours, or is this just a costume to make you look important? The royal guard didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. His face was set in an expressionless mask. His eyes locked straight ahead, ignoring her presence completely. He was trained for moments like this, moments when tourists, often entitled and rude, tried to provoke him. He had been drilled in the art of silence and stillness, a constant in the face of all distractions. Karen stood before him for a long moment, feeling the tension rise in her chest. She was used to being the center of attention, used to people giving her what she wanted the moment she demanded it. But this was something entirely different. The more she insulted him, the more unbothered he seemed. It only made her angrier. Do you understand me? Karen demanded, her face contorting with scorn. You're just a glorified doorman, standing there in your ridiculous uniform. Do you even know what real power is? Because you certainly don't look like you do. The guard's only response was the steady rise and fall of his chest, his breathing calm, unfazed. He had heard it all before, tourists mocking him, belittling his job, thinking they were entitled to special treatment just because they were in the presence of royalty. But to him, this was nothing more than a test of discipline, a test he had passed countless times before. Karen took a step closer, so close now that she was practically in his face. You think you're important, standing there like a statue, she sneered. You think you're a soldier, a part of something bigger. Well, let me tell you something. I don't care about your little traditions, your rules, your royal nonsense. I paid for this tour. I've been waiting for this moment for weeks. And if I can't get in, then neither should anyone else. Understand? She practically spat the last word in his face, as though daring him to react, to break the silence, to show some sign of life. But the royal guard didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge her. His gaze remained forward. Fixed firmly on some distant point beyond her, Karen's hands balled into fists at her sides, her temper now fully ignited. She stepped back and gestured to the guard, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Look at you. You're just a puppet, a cog in the machine. Just like everyone else here, stuck doing what they're told. How pathetic. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Karen, fuming with indignation, waited for him to break. But the guard remained as still and silent as ever. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Karen barked. Or are you too busy pretending to be a part of something you'll never truly understand? Still, the guard said nothing. His silence was maddening to Karen. She couldn't stand the thought that someone, anyone, could remain so unmoved, so calm, while she was seething with anger. She reached forward, her fingers brushing against the edge of his red tunic, as if to force him into some kind of response, but his body remained rigid, his face unwavering. It was as though Karen's presence, her anger, her insults, meant nothing at all. And that, in a way, was the most infuriating thing of all. She stood there for a long moment, her chest heaving with frustration. She had expected some reaction, anything, a flinch, a sign that he was human, like the rest of them. But she had nothing. The guard's composure was a wall, impenetrable and unyielding. Finally, unable to stand the quiet any longer, Karen scoffed loudly and turned on her heel. You're a joke, she muttered under her breath, not bothering to look back. But as she walked away, the royal guard remained exactly where he had been the entire time, his stance unchanged. The sound of her footsteps faded, swallowed by the hum of the crowd, but he did not move an inch. The people around her, who had been watching the scene unfold, exchanged looks, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief. Some whispered to each other, while others silently watched the spectacle. Karen had made a fool of herself, but the royal guard had remained a symbol of quiet, unshakable discipline. In that moment, Karen's outburst was nothing more than a fleeting storm, a tempest that had raged against the stillness of tradition, only to dissipate into nothing. And in the end, it was the royal guard who had stood as a testament to the enduring power of silence. Karen stood there for a moment, her breath ragged with frustration. She had expected to feel a sense of power after her barrage of insults, but instead, she felt ignored, disrespected in a way that she had never experienced. And it infuriated her. Without missing a beat, she stepped closer to the royal guard again, this time with a mocking grin plastered across her face. "Oh, you're still pretending, huh?" "I get it," Karen sneered. "You're like one of those Disney characters. What are you doing here, playing a role, pretending to be part of something important?" She stepped around him, inspecting the bright red uniform like it was a costume on display. "You're no different than one of those actors at Disneyland. Aren't you? They wear their little costumes, stand still, and smile for the tourists. It's all for show. You're just another act, nothing real about it." She was relentless now, pushing closer, invading his space with every word. The crowd had grown larger, uncomfortable murmurs filling the air. They had stopped walking by to watch the drama unfold, unsure of what would happen next, but unwilling to intervene. Karen, sensing the attention, only intensified her attack. "I bet you don't even know what you're standing guard for, do you? What's it like to be so utterly useless? I don't need you to stand there and play pretend. What I need is for you to do something useful." She raised her hands in mock exasperation, her voice growing louder with every passing second. "I paid for this. I'm a paying customer. Do you know what that means? It means you work for me. And here I am, trying to enjoy the history of this palace, and all you're doing is standing there, doing absolutely nothing. What a waste of space. Shouldn't you be serving me like any good employee would?" The royal guard, unfazed by the storm of insults, remained motionless, his eyes forward, his posture as rigid as it had been from the start. Not even a flicker of emotion passed across his face. His silence only seemed to fuel Karen's anger further. "You don't get it, do you?" Karen barked. "You're just a costume with a stupid hat and a shiny button. You're nothing more than an overpriced prop. Do you get paid for this? Or are you just volunteering to stand there like a statue?" She waved her hand dismissively as if the guard were no more significant than an ornamental fixture. The crowd grew more uncomfortable, some tourists glancing at each other, whispering nervously, unsure of how to react. Karen took a step back, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She could feel the eyes on her now, the weight of the crowd's judgment. It was a feeling she wasn't used to. She was used to commanding attention, not being the spectacle. Her voice dropped to a mocking tone, as she leaned in close enough for the guard to hear her. "Tell you what," she said, a wicked smile spreading across her face, "since you're clearly not going to do anything useful, why don't you just step aside? I'll go find someone who's actually working here. Maybe a tour guide, someone who knows what they're doing. A real employee." Still, the guard didn't move. He didn't blink, didn't shift his weight. Nothing. Karen's words hung in the air, but they had no effect on him. His unwavering stillness was, at this point, more than just professional discipline, it felt like a silent challenge to her. Karen's face reddened as the tension in the air thickened. "Are you really going to stand there and let me talk to you like this?" she demanded. Her tone, once sharp, now took on a desperate edge, like she was trying to provoke a reaction, any reaction, from him. "Aren't you even a little embarrassed? Look at yourself. You look ridiculous, standing there, pretending like you're some important figure. The tourists are laughing at you. I'm laughing at you. Everyone is." The tourists around her exchanged uneasy glances, some clearly uncomfortable with the scene Karen was causing, while others were watching, intrigued by how the situation was unfolding. The whispers swirled, but no one dared step in. The spectacle was unfolding right before them, and no one knew how it was going to end. Karen's last words echoed in the air like a challenge that would never be answered. Still, the royal guard stood, unwavering, unmoved by her insults or the crowd's uneasy murmurs. His silence was absolute, like an unbreakable wall. Every word Karen threw at him seemed to bounce off, absorbed by the force of his discipline and training. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Karen stood back, her chest heaving. There was nothing else she could say, nothing else she could do. She had tried everything, every insult, every mockery, every demand. But all she had received in return was silence. Her anger, once so blinding, began to fade, replaced by an odd sense of humiliation. The royal guard had not just ignored her, he had defeated her without lifting a finger. His quiet defiance had exposed her for what she was, an entitled tourist who thought she could buy her way past the rules. With a snarl, Karen spun on her heel, muttering under her breath, and began to walk away. Her pride had been shattered. The crowd watched her go, some still uncomfortable. Others shaken by the encounter. As Karen disappeared into the distance, the royal guard remained standing at attention, his presence as steady and unmoving as ever. The crowd, once silent, slowly began to disperse, their whispers fading into the soft afternoon air, and in the end, it was the guard's silence that spoke louder than anything Karen had said. The enduring power of tradition, respect, and discipline had won out over the tantrum of one entitled tourist. Karen's fury reached its boiling point. She could feel her pulse racing in her temples, her hands trembling with anger. She had thrown every insult she could muster at the royal guard, belittled him, mocked his uniform, his role, yet nothing had worked. He remained unmoving, completely unfazed by her words, standing there like an immovable statue, silent and unwavering. That was it. She had reached her limit. With a sharp, almost primal scream, Karen raised her hand, her fingers curling into a tight fist before she brought it crashing down across the royal guard's cheek. The slap was loud, deafening in the otherwise quiet courtyard. The sound of skin meeting skin echoed across the space. And the collective breath of the crowd was held in stunned silence. The tourists who had been lingering nearby froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some gasped, others quickly pulled out their phones to capture the moment, eager to document the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone waited for the inevitable reaction. Surely, after such an act of defiance, the guard would finally respond, but the response never came. The royal guard did not flinch. He didn't stagger back. He didn't blink. He didn't even move a single muscle. His face remained as still and expressionless as it had been since the moment Karen first began her tirade. His posture, straight as a rod, didn't waver. The only thing that had shifted was the slight rustling of his uniform as the slap reverberated through the courtyard. Karen stood there, her hands still raised, as if expecting some kind of immediate reaction, a gasp, a word, an apology. She stared at him, waiting, perhaps even hoping that he would break his silence. She had never been ignored like this. She had never been met with such a complete lack of response. And then it hit her, he was not going to say anything. He wasn't going to apologize. He wasn't going to do anything. In that moment, the realization struck her with a force greater than the slap itself. The guard hadn't reacted because he didn't need to. He was the embodiment of unshakable discipline, trained to endure, to stand firm no matter what. His silence was not a sign of weakness, as Karen had hoped. It was a testament to his strength. Karen's face reddened in a mix of rage and humiliation. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps to scream again, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? What could she do? The crowd, now completely silent, watched as she stood there. Caught between the shame of having acted out and the anger of being completely ignored, for a brief moment, Karen stood frozen, her hands still hanging in the air, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She had expected him to react, any reaction, any sign of weakness that she could exploit. But instead, she had received nothing but an impenetrable wall of silence. She was the one left exposed, vulnerable, the one who had overstepped, Finally, her hand dropped to her side, and she took a step back, her pride shattered. The applause of the crowd never came. The mockery she had expected didn't follow. Instead, there was only a deep, uncomfortable quiet that enveloped her. The royal guard, still unmoved, continued to stand as if he hadn't even noticed her outburst. He was not her servant, not her employee, not a character to be mocked or manipulated. He was a figure of tradition, duty, and respect, and no amount of shouting, slapping, or insulting would change that. Karen's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. She had expected a reaction. At the very least, she had expected to see him stumble, to show a crack in his calm demeanor, to make her feel like her rage had made some kind of impact. But instead, she was the one left without a response, standing in the midst of a crowd who were now looking at her with expressions of disbelief. The humiliation she felt was worse than any slap. She had not only failed to provoke the guard, but in doing so, she had inadvertently exposed her own vulnerability. The guards were right. She had no power here. Her wealth, her status, her outbursts, they meant nothing in the face of unshakable tradition. The silence stretched out. Karen turned, defeated and furious, her cheeks burning with the sting of both the slap and the realization of her own impotence. Without a word, she began to walk away, her head held high, though she couldn't erase the weight of the crowd's eyes following her every step. The guard, unmoving as ever, remained a silent sentinel as Karen disappeared from view, her tantrum fading into the distance, and in the courtyard, where only moments before Karen had been the center of attention, the crowd slowly began to disperse, the awkward tension lingering in the air like a memory no one wanted to remember. The royal guard remained, steadfast and composed, his silence the final word in the encounter. As Karen turned on her heel and started to walk away, seething with humiliation, the royal guard's stillness was interrupted. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice broke through the tense silence. "Ma'am." Karen froze mid-step, her back still turned to him. Her heart skipped a beat. She was certain she had pushed him to the edge. Surely, after everything, he would give in and either lash out or dismiss her with some final rebuke. But no, he had been silent, unyielding. And now, his voice, calm, measured, and steady, was the only thing filling the silence. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock, a mixture of anger and surprise plastered across her face. "What?" she snapped, her tone still sharp but uncertain now, as if she had expected his indifference to hold. The guard stood tall, his posture unbroken, his gaze unwavering but direct. His uniform, immaculate and precise, still glimmered under the sunlight. His expression remained neutral, but there was a depth in his eyes, a depth that Karen had not noticed before. "I've served in combat zones," he began, his voice surprisingly calm for someone who had just endured such a vile display of disrespect. "Afghanistan, Iraq. I've been through things you can't even imagine." Karen felt a strange sense of unease crawl up her spine, her initial irritation warring with a small flicker of guilt she didn't want to acknowledge. She stood still, waiting, though a part of her urged her to turn and walk away again. "I've earned every medal I wear, ma'am," he continued, his tone still steady, though his words carried weight. "I've been in real combat, shootouts, bombings, seeing men fall beside me. The uniform I wear, this one that you mock, it's not a costume. It represents sacrifice. Duty. Courage. Not some little act for tourists to scoff at." The crowd, which had been murmuring in the background, quieted even further as they absorbed the gravity of his words. Karen felt the spotlight shift, her previous bravado now crumbling beneath the weight of the guard's calm revelation. "I didn't stand in front of Buckingham Palace to play pretend," the guard said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here because I chose to serve. To protect, to fight. And I wear this uniform with honor, not because I was asked to stand still and look pretty, but because I've earned the right to wear it." He paused for a moment, his eyes briefly glancing down at the medals pinned to his chest, then back at Karen. "I've lost friends, seen things that will haunt me for the rest of my life," he said, his voice still calm, but now tinged with a rawness that Karen hadn't expected. And every one of those medals I earned was through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. So when you mock the uniform, when you treat my service as some sort of joke, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting the thousands of men and women who have served, those who gave everything so that people like you can walk around without understanding what it truly costs. The air between them was thick now, every word hanging heavy in the space. Karen had no retort. For the first time, her defiance felt small and misplaced, her insults dissonant against the truth of his words. She had no idea. She had no idea what it meant to live through the things he had experienced, to wear that uniform for reasons far beyond her comprehension. Do you know what it's like, he continued, his eyes softening just slightly, to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders and still stand at attention, still follow the orders, even when your mind and body are screaming at you to stop. To know you might not come back, but still, you go because it's your duty. Karen stood frozen, her mind grappling with the enormity of what he was saying. She had spent the entire time belittling him, mocking his role as if it were something trivial. But in that moment, she began to understand, the uniform was not just cloth and metal. It was a symbol of years of sacrifice, of pain, of loyalty. The guard didn't wait for her to respond. He had said what needed to be said. "You're free to go, ma'am," he said, his tone now final, a calm acceptance in his voice. "But next time you think of mocking someone's duty, remember there are people who wear this uniform because they chose to serve and protect, not because they wanted a spotlight." With that, he turned his gaze back to the distance, resuming his still posture. His words, though firm, left no room for debate. Karen stood there for a moment, her throat tight, her mind racing with thoughts she wasn't sure how to process. She had expected a reaction, anger, perhaps, something to confirm her superiority. But what she got was the harsh truth. Slowly, her anger seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a quiet shame that was difficult to swallow. She had no words left to say. No insults. No defenses. She turned around without another word and walked away. The crowd slowly began to disperse as well, some still murmuring, others silent, perhaps reflecting on the guard's words. Karen's footsteps felt heavier now, and the weight of her own actions pressed down on her as she left Buckingham Palace behind. The royal guard remained standing, his posture as straight as ever, his gaze once again fixed on the horizon. Unmoved by the scene that had unfolded. The palace, a symbol of power and tradition, stood proudly behind him, a silent witness to the lesson that had just been taught. As Karen walked away, her head hung low in a mixture of confusion and growing humility, the crowd continued to murmur softly. The royal guard remained silent, unwavering, his presence like a sentinel guarding not just the gates of Buckingham Palace, but the dignity that Karen had momentarily disregarded. But as Karen took a few more steps, something unexpected happened. From the edge of the crowd, an elderly man, his back slightly hunched with age but his bearing still strong, stepped forward. He wore a faded jacket adorned with the insignia of military service. And his eyes, sharp despite the years, locked on Karen. He moved with purpose, his cane tapping rhythmically on the ground as he approached the guard. The crowd, sensing another presence, parted slightly, allowing the elderly man to make his way to the center of the scene. He stopped just a few feet away from the guard, raising his hand in a gesture of respect before speaking. "I've been standing here, listening," the elderly man began, his voice rough but steady, carrying the weight of years of experience. "And I've heard enough." Karen, still caught in the haze of her own emotions, turned at the sound of the old man's voice. Her gaze flicked to the guard, and for the first time since the confrontation, she noticed something new. It wasn't just the guard's discipline that had silenced her, it was the presence of another who understood what this uniform truly represented. The elderly man's eyes turned to her, and he spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "You think you know what it means to be in this uniform, young lady?" He gestured to the royal guard standing at attention. His finger pointing to the immaculate red tunic and polished brass buttons. "You think it's just for show, just a costume for the tourists?" Karen, still reeling from the guard's words, felt the heat rise in her chest again. But before she could respond, the elderly man continued, his voice growing softer, yet more powerful with each word, "Let me tell you something. This uniform, this guard's uniform, it's not just cloth and metal. It's a symbol of honor. It's a symbol of sacrifice. It's a reminder of the commitment we made when we swore to serve, to protect, and to stand firm in the face of adversity." Karen stood frozen as the old man's words sank in. She didn't know how to react. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him. The elderly man's gaze softened, his eyes betraying the pain of a life lived through struggle, through loss, and through years of service. "I wore a uniform too, a long time ago. I served in the military. I fought in wars, saw things no person should see. But the hardest part of service wasn't the battles, it was the duty. The responsibility we carry to our fellow soldiers, to our country, to those who rely on us." The crowd had fallen completely silent now, as though they too could feel the weight of the man's words. Karen, feeling smaller than she ever had, listened intently, her earlier sense of entitlement beginning to crumble. "When I wore this uniform, it wasn't for fame or recognition," the elderly man continued, his voice thick with the memories of his youth. "It wasn't for the applause, the photos, or the tourists who come to gawk. It was because we had a duty to something greater than ourselves. A duty to serve, no matter the cost. A duty that many of us, including me, paid with blood, with sweat, with tears." He looked at Karen then, his eyes steady. "This man," he gestured to the royal guard. "He stands here, not because he wants to be a figurehead, not because it's a game. He stands here because it's his job, his honor, and his duty. He represents not just the palace, but the commitment of every soldier who has ever worn a uniform in defense of freedom." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her sense of superiority slipping away like sand through her fingers. The man's words were like a quiet storm, sweeping away the arrogance she had carried with her so effortlessly. The elderly veteran continued, his voice unwavering despite the emotion creeping in. "And you, with all due respect, have no idea what that means. You've mocked him and his uniform. But that uniform represents something far greater than a tourist attraction. It represents lives sacrificed, families torn apart, and commitments kept even in the darkest of times." Karen's heart pounded in her chest. Her eyes flickered back and forth between the guard and the veteran, her mind scrambling for some defense, some justification. But there was none. All her earlier accusations, her insults, everything, suddenly seemed petty, inconsequential. The elderly man took a step back, his gaze lingering on Karen. "The real question is, can you understand what it means to serve with honor? Can you respect that commitment, even if you don't understand it fully? Because if you can't, then you've missed the point entirely." Karen's throat tightened, her mouth dry. She had nothing to say. Her earlier confidence had been shattered, replaced by a crushing weight of guilt and shame. She had mocked these men who had given so much for their countries, for their fellow citizens, for their sense of duty, and for what? Because she thought she was above it all. Because she thought her status could get her through anything. The elderly man gave one last nod to the royal guard before slowly turning to walk away, his cane tapping rhythmically on the ground. As he disappeared into the crowd, the silence that followed was deafening. The weight of his words hung in the air like a dense fog. Karen stood still for a moment, her head down, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their judgment heavy in the air. But more than that, she could feel the weight of the lesson she had just learned. The realization of how wrong she had been settled like a stone in her stomach. The royal guard, still standing motionless, had not spoken another word. But the lesson had already been taught, not just to Karen, but to everyone who had witnessed the exchange, for the first time. Karen understood that true power wasn't about wealth or status, it was about sacrifice. It was about duty. It was about serving something greater than oneself. And in that moment, she knew that she would never look at a uniform, or the people who wore them, the same way again. The silence lingered in the air as Karen stood frozen, her mind racing. The weight of the elderly veteran's words had struck her with such force that she could barely process what had happened. The anger, the arrogance, the sense of superiority, everything that had driven her to act out, everything she had believed was justified, was now crumbling into dust. As she stood there, head down, trying to gather her thoughts, the distant hum of sirens slowly grew louder. Karen barely registered the sound at first, her mind still reeling from the exchange with the royal guard and the elderly veteran. But as the sound grew nearer, she felt the unease in her chest tighten. Before she could react, a squad car pulled up at the entrance of Buckingham Palace, and 2 police officers stepped out, their expressions grim. The crowd, which had been silent throughout the confrontation, began to murmur again. But this time, it wasn't in curiosity. It was in recognition. People stepped back, some shaking their heads, others watching with a mixture of pity and disbelief. One of the officers approached Karen, his demeanor firm but calm. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assaulting a royal guard," he said, his voice clear and professional. "You need to come with us." Karen's breath hitched, her stomach dropping. The shame that had already been building inside her now seemed to take over, washing over her in waves. Assaulting a royal guard? She had never imagined it would come to this. She had thought her words, her insults, would be forgotten, or at worst, brushed aside. But this was real. The consequences of her actions had come crashing down. I didn't mean to," Karen stammered, her voice trembling. She instinctively took a step back, as though to distance herself from the police officers, but there was nowhere to run. She was trapped by her own actions. It was just a mistake. I didn't know." The officer didn't respond immediately. He simply stepped forward, his hand extended in a gesture that demanded compliance. "Ma'am, you've made your choice, and the law is clear. Please, come with us." Karen's mind raced, but all the bravado, all the anger, all the excuses she had been carrying with her evaporated in an instant. She had no more words to defend herself. Her previous defiance had been a shield, one that had now shattered, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and, worst of all, ashamed. As the officer placed the cuffs on her wrists, Karen's eyes flicked up toward the royal guard and the elderly veteran. The guard still stood tall, his posture rigid, his face as emotionless as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. The elderly veteran, too, remained standing, his back straight despite his age, his gaze steady and unwavering. They hadn't moved an inch. They hadn't shown an ounce of weakness. They hadn't even looked at her with anything other than the quiet resolve that came from understanding the true meaning of discipline and duty. In that moment, Karen realized how hollow her previous arrogance had been. She had thought herself better than everyone around her, above the rules, above the consequences. But now, standing before 2 men who embodied honor, sacrifice, and unwavering discipline, she could see just how wrong she had been. They had shown her, in their silence and in their steadfastness, what it truly meant to live with purpose and respect. Her shoulders slumped as she was led away by the officers, her steps slow and heavy. The crowd parted once more, but this time. There were no whispers of admiration, no judgment of her actions, only the sound of her footsteps echoing through the courtyard, a stark reminder of the lesson she had learned too late. The royal guard and the elderly veteran remained standing, a quiet monument to the values that had been so carelessly disregarded by Karen. As they watched her leave, they didn't need to say anything more. Their silence spoke volumes. Karen's bravado had melted away, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of shame. She had come to Buckingham Palace seeking admiration, seeking a moment to feel superior. Instead, she left with nothing but the humbling knowledge of just how small and insignificant her actions had been in the grand scheme of things. And as the police car drove away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, leaving the palace gates once again quiet and undisturbed. The guard remained at his post, the veteran turned back toward the distance, and the lessons of discipline, service, and respect lived on, not in words, but in the stillness of their actions. As Karen was escorted away by the police officers, the silence that followed was unlike anything that had come before. The crowd, which had been captivated by her outburst just moments earlier, now stood in hushed reverence, a stark contrast to the earlier spectacle. The murmurs of disbelief faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding of what had just transpired. It wasn't just the guards or the veteran who had imparted a lesson. It was the crowd itself that seemed to absorb the lesson of respect, discipline, and duty. A palpable shift had taken place. Where Karen had once stood, arrogantly assuming her superiority, now stood a deeper understanding of what true authority meant. As the police car carrying Karen disappeared down the road, the crowd began to settle. Eyes that had once been focused on her now turned to the royal guard and the elderly veteran. The two figures who had remained unyielding throughout the ordeal. And slowly, a sense of quiet admiration began to build. A young boy, no more than 10 or 11, stepped forward from the crowd. He had been one of the first to ask about Karen's behavior earlier, his innocent voice piercing through the chaos. His wide eyes, filled with curiosity and confusion, now took on a new light, a quiet respect that had not been there before. "Sir," the boy said, his voice soft but clear, addressing the veteran who had spoken so powerfully just moments before. "I think I understand now." He paused, as if processing everything that had just happened. "I thought she was right at first. I didn't get why she had to leave, but now I see. She wasn't respecting you. Or your uniform." The veteran smiled, a faint nod of approval at the boy's words. The guard, still standing firm and silent, offered no response but seemed to acknowledge the boy's insight with a subtle shift in posture. The boy continued, his words simple but filled with an earnestness that came from a place of deep understanding. "It's like how my grandfather always talks about respect. He says that the people who serve, who protect, they do it because they believe in something bigger than themselves." He looked up at the guard with newfound respect. "I didn't understand before, but now I see you're not just standing here for no reason. You're here for something important." The crowd, which had been waiting for the next moment of spectacle, now found themselves moved by the boy's words. The innocence with which he spoke was a stark contrast to Karen's entitlement, and in his simple reflection, the crowd saw what had been lost in the chaos. He represented the respect for tradition, the dignity that Karen had scorned in her outburst, and the honor that the royal guard and the veteran embodied. The elderly veteran, his eyes softening at the boy's understanding, knelt down slightly to meet his gaze. "You're right, young man," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This uniform represents more than just standing at attention. It's about what we give, what we sacrifice, and how we honor those who came before us. It's about respect, not just for the uniform, but for the responsibility that comes with it." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with realization. He stepped back, a look of quiet pride on his face as he returned to his family. In that moment it was clear that the boy had learned a lesson that would stick with him for a long time. The innocence with which he spoke had brought clarity to the entire scene, and he symbolized the understanding that Karen had missed. The crowd, still lingering in the courtyard, now turned to the royal guard, offering silent nods of acknowledgement and respect. People who had once been uncertain or uncomfortable with the situation now stood in reverence, recognizing the true meaning of authority and discipline. The incident had not only exposed Karen's failure to understand these values, it had highlighted the profound dignity and sacrifice embodied in the uniform. And as the last of the onlookers slowly began to disperse, the courtyard fell into a quiet stillness once more. The royal guard, standing as resolutely as ever, remained the embodiment of discipline, his presence a testament to the honor and sacrifice that Karen had so carelessly dismissed. The elderly veteran, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of a lifetime of service, turned and began to walk away. His steps were slow but deliberate, the weight of years and experiences carried with grace. The lesson he had imparted had not just been for Karen, it had been for everyone who had witnessed the scene. His words about sacrifice, honor, and respect had resonated deeply, leaving behind a quiet but powerful legacy. As the final echoes of the crowd's footsteps faded, the lingering lesson about respect, dignity, and the true nature of authority remained in the air. It had not been spoken with loud declarations or grand gestures, it had been quietly woven into the fabric of the moment by the actions of the guard, the veteran, and even the young boy. For Karen, the journey had been a painful one, filled with the humiliation of her own actions. But for the crowd and the young boy, the true meaning of tradition and service had been made clear. And in that quiet moment, as the palace gates stood tall, it was evident that the lesson about respect and sacrifice would not soon be forgotten. As Karen was led away, the crowd quietly absorbed the powerful lesson unfolding before them. The elderly veteran's words about duty, honor, and sacrifice lingered in the air, a reminder that true strength lies in principles, not wealth or status. The royal guard, despite the slap, stood unwavering, his dignity intact. His silence spoke volumes, proving that respect is earned through integrity and commitment, not demanded through entitlement. The lesson was clear: authority is not a symbol of superiority, but a reflection of sacrifice and service. Respect, when deserved, is never given lightly, and it cannot be taken by force. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.